Thank you so much. Wow, I really enjoyed the worship times. Josh, thank you. This special time, and it's been a real refreshing time for my wife Kathy and I. And the grind of the pastorate is not something I'm complaining about, but it's real. It's a grind, and this has been a refreshing time for us. And appreciated an honorarium that was given, but if I had to pay some money to come and do this, I would have done that. I didn't tell them that before. I would have paid to come. We're continuing looking at the subject of leadership from the book of Nehemiah. I just entitled the whole series, Courageous Leadership. There's more covered in the book of Nehemiah than leadership, but that is the main theme. And we're going to look in chapter 2 of Nehemiah this morning. Not every verse, but I was going through a lot of the verses as we talk about getting down to some real specifics, how leaders lead. And that's the direction we're headed, and I'll just go till the time runs out, and we'll just cut it off right there. In chapter 2, we kind of got more idea of a biblical standpoint, which is the standpoint of truth. We get more of an idea of what a real leader is. There's a lot out there that's been written by it about leaders that I'm afraid are not very biblical. Perhaps you may be here and say, I wish we had somebody speak on something that was more relevant to me. The leadership thing is not relevant. Well, I beg to differ with you. In one sense, every Christian is to be a leader. Every Christian. Maybe your problem is you've narrowed down too small what leadership really is. Let me ask you a question. For whom was the Great Commission, go into all the world and make disciples? For whom was that meant? All of us, every Christian. And in making disciples, what is the first thing you do in that process? You walk them to Christ. Lead them to Christ. You say, that's not what we're really talking about. Yeah, it is. It's included. But beyond just leading people to Christ, the whole concept of being a leader is very broad. Let me give you some examples. Perhaps the most leadership-intensive responsibility on earth is being a mother. And then a grandmother. And equal to that is being a father. So I never thought of that as leadership. Oh, but that's what real leadership is. Teachers at any level of any age. Teachers are leaders. And then, of course, there's what we traditionally think of business owners and supervisors and coaches and ministry directors and on and on and on. Don't discount these principles just because you don't have the title of chairman of or director of in front of your name. Leadership is much broader than most people think. I'm focusing in on the church, but it can be applied to any area. I was in a seminar one time and heard a man speaking, and he made this statement. He said, the church is, and I think we would include parachurch with that, everything related to the church. The church is the most leadership-intensive enterprise on earth. I got to thinking about that. It's right. The church is the most leadership-intensive. He called it an enterprise. It's more than that, but it's the most leadership-intensive enterprise on earth. And one reason so many churches and so many parachurch organizations and ministries flounder is because many times pastors and ministry leaders don't really know how to lead. I got to thinking as I was preparing for this. I went to college for 4 years at the University of Tennessee and got a degree in business administration. In my recollection, and I've still got all my report cards that I try to hide or I could be blackmailed. But I was looking through those. I never had one class that majored on, and even really I remember talked about leadership. In my first go-around of seminary, way back in the 1970s, obtained a Master of Divinity degree that was an 88 semester hour degree. I did not have one single class on leadership, how to lead. There are hundreds and hundreds of books that have been written on leadership. Many of them are really good, and many of them not so much. But in my opinion, the greatest resource for learning how to lead is the Bible. Now, it certainly is more than that, but in the Scriptures, there are all these principles, and they're not hidden so that you got to be really smart to dig down deep to find them. They're right there out right in the open of leadership. It doesn't always use the terminology of leadership, but what you're seeing are examples of how leaders lead. And I think the most leadership-intensive book in the Bible is the book of Nehemiah. Leadership, in my opinion, is not as complicated as some people make it. Powerful leadership basically has 4 simple ingredients. And let me just give them to you. Some of them we've already dealt with, but some I just need to lay out, and one we're dealing with today. First of all, the leadership, the first ingredient is a burden or a call from God. We dealt with that last night. A burden or a call from God. You say, well, I've not been called to any of that. I'm just called to be a mom, or I'm just called to be a dad, or just to raise a family. No, we've already established that's intensive leadership. And you need the burden from God. And then after the burden from God comes a vision, and that's what we're going to look at today. And then there's a plan to implement the vision. We're going to talk some about that today. And then a purposed heart. I love that terminology. I heard it somewhere and it stuck. A purposed heart to depend on God's power and to never give up. That's really, you see, we're not talking here something you got to have PhDs in order to understand. Now, whether it's ministry in CBM, ministry in a church, whether it's with a family, whether it's in teaching school, whether it's in a business endeavor, these are the 4 ingredients that make up courageous leadership. Now let's talk a little about vision before we get into the text. Vision is the ability to see the God-desired end product and become passionate about it. Now, let me repeat that. Vision is the ability to see the God-desired end product and to be passionate about it. Without God-implanted, passionate vision, it's impossible to lead with passion, and it's contagious passion. Passion is contagious when you get really so excited about something other people are. You know, I sometimes wish, I've heard testimonies, I don't sit down and critique people's testimonies, I love to hear anybody's testimony, but sometimes I think, I wish somebody would give you a little help here. I just want to tell you how much I love Jesus. I'm just thankful for Him and going to heaven when I die. Hallelujah. Amen. That's kind of, leadership, you say, well, that's just not my personality. Well, who cares? You ought to be passionate about the things that really matter in the areas where God has called you into leadership. Somebody said that being a leader today is very difficult because you can't be sure if the people behind you are following you or chasing you. And especially if you're in Christian ministry, you're just not real sure of that. I've had some I thought were following me and found out later they were chasing me. But either way, people follow passionate people who know where they're going. Jesus knew where He was going. I mean, this one who was God the Son, who came flesh, He knew where He was going. He knew why He was here. He kept talking about, He had an appointment to make out there, speaking of the cross. But He saw beyond the cross to the resurrection and the glory of the transformed lives of those who would turn to Him. That vision drove Him. It set His timetable. He was always moving toward what He was here for. And he would be very popular in some areas. And instead of hanging around, if I had been where Jesus was and there were all these people against me and I finally found a place where they really liked me, I'd just hang out right there the rest of the time. But Jesus said, no, I have an appointment. And his appointment was the cross. And there he went. He kept going. He knew where he was headed. I love Warren Wiersbe. He has such a simple way of saying things. Listen to this quote. He said, leaders must see what others don't see, and then challenge others to follow until they do see. Boy, that's a great, great definition, or better, a description of leadership. When we get totally surrendered before God, seek His face, examine His Word, He will, in His timing, give us His vision for our life. Listen, God wants you to know His plan for you, where you're to pour out your vision. He wants you to know that more than you do. Sometimes He's got a higher goal, and that's to draw you to Himself. And so you say, well, I'm praying, I just don't really know. Well, just keep praying and drawing near to Him, loving Him, obeying Him, and it'll come. It will come. Now, this vision that of Christ had never contradicted, and the vision God will give you will never contradict His Word. It'll always be in conjunction with His Word, and usually He'll use something in His Word to really settle it and seal it in your heart that this is what God wants me to do. Now, the main thing I want you to see is that while a vision is essential in courageous leadership, a vision is not enough. It takes more. That's foundational, but it's more than that. A call or a burden from God and a picture of the final product and the passion that comes through that, and then doing what is necessary to communicate and fulfill the vision, that's where it gets tough. That's where it gets not so exciting, but necessary. And that's what we're going to focus on. So here we go. First of all, leaders lead through God-directed preparation. And we see that in the first 16 verses in chapter 2. A passionate burden and vision. Now listen to this. This is an important statement. It's so practical. Listen carefully. A passionate burden and vision must be translated into a workable plan. Have you ever known somebody that's got all these high, lofty things they talk about? It's so vague, nobody can get a handle on them. I don't like being around people like that. They're excited, they got the passion, but it's like, it's just talk. It's just emotion. Visionaries who cannot get their vision down into a workable plan will not have followers for very long. Those rah-rah talks and like, let's get in, like, do it. You know, they have a short lifespan if it's not accompanied by some concrete things. Those who follow a leader must see some results, some progress toward the fulfillment of the vision. How is the vision going to happen? What's a part of it? How's it going to be brought about? So let's see how Nehemiah's burden and vision of a city without walls, wanting to see it would be a vision with walls, and we talked about all of the symbolism and really the significance of the walls, and kind of tied it to our day. So let's see how Nehemiah's burden, his vision of a city with walls, was carried out. First of all, we'll look in the first 10 verses and see that there was a prayed-through strategy. It came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him. Remember, Nehemiah was the cupbearer. That means Nehemiah was before him. I, Nehemiah, took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart. So I became dreadfully afraid. And I said to the king, may the king live forever. I'm sure under his breath, me too. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste and its gates are burned with fire? Then the king said to me, what do you request? Now that's amazing. This is the king. What do you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven. Now that doesn't mean that he went on a retreat, got on his knees. It was just like one of those, oh God, help me. So I prayed. I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. So the king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, how long will your journey be? And when will you return? And so it pleased the king to send me. And I set him a time. Furthermore, I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the regions beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give us timber, make beams for the gates and the citadel which pertains to the temple, for the city wall, and for the house that I will occupy. And the king granted them to me, according to the good hand of my God upon me. Then I went to the governors in the region beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. And when Sanballat, Horonite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite official, heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. Now that is just packed absolutely full of great truths about leadership. The kings of Persia, like Artaxerxes, were absolute in their rule. They didn't have any checks and balances as we have in our government. They were the dictators. They were the check, they were the balance, they were it. And this particular king, Artaxerxes, had a reputation for never changing his mind. Once he'd stated something, it would not be changed. And earlier, he had put a stop to building the wall around Jerusalem. You read about that in Ezra chapter 7, verses 17 through 23. Nehemiah knew that in order for this vision to be accomplished, the king's mind had to be changed, and that had never happened. And yet Nehemiah knew that only God could change it. You may have a vision, you say there's no way it can happen. But if it's from God, it can. Nehemiah knew that God is sovereign and all-powerful, and he knew the truth of what I believe is one of the top 3 verses relating to prayer and encouragement in prayer in all the Bible. And it's found in Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord like the rivers of water. He, that is the Lord, turns it wherever he wishes. That is a great promise. The word translated rivers here, it can probably better be translated channel, and it actually referred to an irrigation channel. So we're not talking about the Mississippi River. God can divert that and send it wherever he wants to. He surely could do that. You know, the Mississippi River did flow backwards once. It really did. That's another story. God can do anything. But he's talking here about an irrigation channel. In other words, he's saying, for God, this is no big deal. The heart, which includes our will as it's used here, the heart of those in authority is in the Lord's hand, and he can change their heart like changing of an irrigation channel, an irrigation ditch. In other words, God just speaks and it's done. And so, something that had never happened before on this earthly king, Nehemiah could believe God for, because he knew that God could change the heart of even the king of Persia. Now, I love Hudson Taylor. He's my hero of heroes. Hudson Taylor, the pioneer missionary to inland China, said, it is possible to move men through God by prayer alone. Do you really believe that? I do. Sometimes we forget that. You say, well, I tried that, and so-and-so shut the door. Well, pray that God will turn his heart like the channels of water, and he'll open the door. He can do that. Now, our problem is we want it done as soon as we ask, and God says, no, I want to teach you some things through it. But if that's what he wants, he can change the heart. When we compare chapter 1, verse 1 with chapter 2, verse 1, we find that Nehemiah had been, I mentioned this earlier, Nehemiah had been diligently praying and waiting patiently for God to work for 4 months. For 4 months he's been praying. It tells us he'd been fasting in chapter 1, praying and fasting. Faith and patience go together. Have you ever thought about that? Faith and patience go together. Hebrews 6:12 puts it best. It says that you do not become sluggish, but imitate those who through faith and patience inherit promises. Hebrews 6:12. Faith and patience inherit promises. Now let me remind you of a hard truth. It's not only that God can change the heart of another person, only God can change the heart of another person. And so he doesn't need you to help him out. Don't try to manipulate people. Don't try to come up with schemes. Don't try to short-circuit what is ethical rules. Trust God. He can change a heart like changing an irrigation ditch in a large field. God, in answer to believing prayer, can do what manipulation can never do. While Nehemiah was waiting those 4 months, you know what he was doing? He wasn't just sitting around twiddling his thumbs, so to speak. He was planning. What's that a sign of? He believed God was going to do it. God gave him this burden, had called him, given him a passion for it, and so he's praying. And the moment finally came in God's timing to lay out the vision before the king. I mean, he's just doing his normal stuff, and the king says, "Hey, Nehemiah, you look sad." Now, that you say, well, why is that so important? That was capital punishment. If you showed sadness in the sign of the king, it was probably evidence you were involved in some conspiracy against him, and so you were killed. And that's why Nehemiah, after he says that, he says that he was very afraid. Why? Because that meant that, well, normally he could be killed. And so, instead, look what he did. And so, and said to the king, "May the king live forever." I'm sure under his breath he said, "Me too. Why should my face not be sad?" And he begins to talk about the need. And as he's talking, he's praying to the God of heaven. Have you ever done that? You say, "Well, I'm kind of one channel, I've got to do." No, you need to learn that as you're talking, you say, "Oh God, bring this in. Lord, open their heart. Lord, make this clear. Lord, I don't think I'm doing a very good job presenting this. Change it around. Fix me up, Lord. Give me words to say." You know, that the Lord will help you to work that way. You can get multitasking there in your prayers. The Lord leaves his heart open. That's the principle. Nehemiah lived in an atmosphere of prayer. You know, that's what 1 Thessalonians 5:17 means when it says to pray without ceasing. It doesn't mean you're always walking around. You know, there was a group of Pharisees. This is not in the Bible, but from history, there's a group of Pharisees called the bruised and bleeding Pharisees, because they believed in praying all the time, and so they prayed with their eyes closed, and they were called bruised and bleeding because they kept bumping into stuff and getting run over by stuff. That's not what praying without ceasing means. You don't have to be a bruised and bleeding Pharisee to do that. It simply means you're in an atmosphere of prayer, and when, even in a conversation, you hear something, even when a need comes up and you're wondering what to do or how to respond, you're just praying, "God, give me words to say. Lord, should I keep my mouth shut or should I speak up here?" That's what it means to pray without ceasing. That's what Nehemiah was doing. Now, a vision is exciting. Producing a strategy is just hard work. Real hard work. I remember many years ago, a young man had called. He was in a church of a friend of mine who was of another denomination. We didn't agree on some areas, but we agreed on who Jesus was and how to be saved. So we were brothers in Christ and became good friends. He was a member of the Assemblies of God, and we developed a good relationship. And he brought me a young man out of his church one day and said, "This young man wants to talk to you." And so we sat down, and this young man, he wasn't that young. He was probably 30 or so, which for me now is real young. But he was probably 30. And he sat down and began to share the excitement of a vision he had from God. And not one of these, seeing people and all that, but a vision as we're talking about. And it was for the youth of our community. And he'd already found a building that was available, and he wanted to start this after-school thing for high school students, and having Christian concerts and people there to just mix and mingle and share the gospel with them, and they would have refreshments, food, and have all the churches in the town who were coming in and trying to help with that, and he was so excited, and he said, and we were wondering if you could help us financially. That's what it usually comes down to, and I tried to affirm. I didn't come back and say, "I've got some news for you, young man." I was affirming. Great vision. Thank you for coming and sharing it with me. I didn't want to be one of those that was in the bucket committee that's always going around pouring cold water on people's ideas and visions. But he was asking for money, so I had to ask some questions. And I said, and I'm paraphrasing because this has been several years ago, but I said, well, who would staff the youth center every week? How are you going to get those people? And is there training for them? What are your plans there? He said, well, I hadn't really thought about that. And I said, and you're talking about some money here, money being spent. What's your accountability? How are you going to be accountable in the financial area? He didn't really know. I said, and how much do you need to get it started up with the improvements you want to make and all that? Well, he wasn't quite sure. And you know what? I was really nice and smiled and all that. But I told him to basically come back when you got more details. That was many years ago. I've never seen him since. You know why? Because that hashing out how a vision is going to be accomplished is hard work. The presence of faith does not mean the absence of organization. I understand that, and you in the camping ministry, you really understand that. You know, all the glorious, like, we get to influence all these kids' lives, and we get to do all this, and sometimes you're thinking, I didn't know I signed up for this. And you're having to do the mundane things, coming up with plans, details. That's a part of leadership. Organization is a concrete manifestation of faith. Organization is not accomplished in the power of our own flesh, but is approached with this sense of complete dependence upon God. I love Proverbs 16:9. A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Leaders, do you have a prayed-through strategy, a plan to accomplish what God's given you a vision to accomplish? Now notice what Nehemiah had planned, though, through when presented to the king. That's how we can see what all he planned. The king asked him, you know, what do you need, Nehemiah? And Nehemiah, he didn't have to say, well, king, give me a week and I'll get back to you on that. He was ready right then. In verses 4 and 5, he knew he needed the king's permission. In verses 7 and 9, and really in verse 3 also, he talks about, I need the king's protection to give me letters, because I'm going to have to go through several territories that's under your rule, but they won't believe me. I need a letter from the king so that they'll let me pass. I need the king's provision. Verse 8 said to get the wood I'm going to need, to get everything I need. Nehemiah had that all figured out. He had a plan. That's a great characteristic of leaders. God had prepared the king's heart, and he gave Nehemiah everything he asked for, but here's what's neat. He even gave Nehemiah some stuff he didn't even ask for. Verse 9 says that the king also sent an armed escort with him. He didn't even ask for that. And later we find out the king actually named him as the governor of the place they had where Jerusalem was in that situation, that place. And Nehemiah, there's no record of him even asking for those. In verse 10, we're introduced to two men that you'll hear a whole lot more about if you read the book of Nehemiah. A Horonite, one of those guys we meet there in verse 10 is, what was his name? Let's see, Sanballat. Boy, he's a big player on this scene. He's one of the villains. He was a Horonite. That means they worship the false god Horon. H-O-R-O-N would be the English transliteration of that. And Tobiah, who was an Ammonite, that was a descendant of Lot's, who was Abraham's nephew, the Ammonites. One of his names Ammon. And they were related to the Jews, but not Jews. They were trouble. And you file that away as you read through. That little verse 10 helps you to understand a lot of other stuff when you get to it. Well, there was a practical assessment in verses 11 through 16. Now he's at Jerusalem. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. And then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do in Jerusalem, nor was there any animal with me except the one which I rode. I went out by night through the valley gate to the serpent well and the refuse gate. Viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates, which were burned with fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal under me to pass. So I went in the night by the valley and viewed the wall. I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I'd gone or what I'd done. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the others who did the work. Now, what was Nehemiah doing during these early days when he got there, just gotten there? Well, for one thing, he was just kind of surveying things, probably rest a little bit. I mean, he'd just come 700 plus miles. He was probably still suffering from camel leg. But primarily, he was making an assessment of the situation. He had heard about the walls and the situation, but now he was looking at it. Don't think of his task as being, when he says build the walls around the city, it's not like putting up a chain link fence around the city. This wall would cover a distance, not that it was straight, it was curved, and it had to go out for this part and that part, but altogether it was over a mile. It needed to be 3 feet thick, and it was about 20 feet high. This was no minor undertaking. Effective leaders are not a bunch of positive thinking, everything's going to be wonderful, it's all going to work out somehow, happy, happy, joy, joy. No, they're realists. They recognize, Lord, this is major. This is going to be a problem. One of the things I deal with young pastors, one of the ways you can have influence on young pastors is to become an old pastor. And at least you know a lot of things not to tell them not to do. And, and it's interesting to watch their enthusiasm, but to sit down and say, yeah, but now have you ever thought about why they're that way, why the church is struggling with that, why they fired the last 3 guys before you? That might be worth looking into. Nehemiah took an honest and no doubt a painful look at the size of the task, but when he spoke with knowledge. He knew what it was going to take. There was the size of the task, there was the history of failure. They tried to build the wall before it had failed. There was discouragement from all the residents around them, and Nehemiah needed to hear from God. He needed to spend that time alone with God, seeing what needed to be done. You see the result of these 3 days when you get into chapter 3 as he organizes the people. We won't look at chapter 3, but it's interesting. It's kind of boring when you're reading it because it's got a bunch of names. A lot of it is. But what you get out of chapter 3 is that Nehemiah had this thing organized. He said, this is what it takes to accomplish the task. Well, you're going to have to listen real fast. Here we go. Leaders lead through God-directed preparation. Secondly, leaders lead through God-centered motivation. This is really important. This is probably the most important part. How do you motivate people to come alongside to accomplish the vision that God's given you? Verses 17 and 18. Then I said to them, you see the distress that we're in and how Jerusalem lies waste and its gates are burned with fire? Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God which had been good upon me, and also the king's words and how he had spoken to me. And so they said, let us rise up and build. Then they set their hands to do this good work. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, he who thinks he is leading and no one is following is only taking a walk. Whatever area of leadership you're in, you must have the people that you're with following. They must learn to trust you. I asked the Lord one day when I turned 50, which that was a long time ago, and I said, Lord, I'm available if I think I've learned a little now through the years and to mentor young pastors. And boy, did he ever answer that exceedingly above anything I could ask or think. And suddenly they started coming, and it was always the same thing. These young guys, it was like, yeah, I got this vision, and we're going to bring it out, and by next month we're going to have this, and the next. And I said, whoa, you're thinking of changing the whole culture of a 120-year-old church in 3 months. You need to think in terms of 3 to 6 years. They'd look at me like I had 4 eyes. And some of them listened, most of them didn't, and they ended up, many of them, I've got a, I should really put out a brochure about how much I can help people. Most of the people I counsel got fired. But it wasn't my fault. At least a lot of them did. And look at the pronouns here in verse 17 Nehemiah uses. He said, you, we, us, we. He's giving them true biblical motivation. You see, there are 2 basic kinds of motivation. There's external motivation and internal motivation. And let me show you the difference between those 2. First of all, external motivation. This is motivation that depends on rewards or consequences. And so they're outward things. And it's not always wrong to have external motivation. An example would be a mother who says to her 3-year-old child, if you'll take a bath without pitching a fit, I'll give you a cookie. Okay, that may get the bath, but you're going to find out that's going to come back to bite you later on. All right? You will. It's like, where's my cookie? You're like, well, I'm not giving you a cookie every time we take a bath. It pitched again. And so, and adults are that way. You know, if you develop the thing, if you do a good job, you get a bonus at the end of the year. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm saying if that becomes what your primary motivation is, external motivation has a very short lifespan. Let's look at internal motivation. This type of motivation is just what it sounds like. It's motivation using that which is not material. As you read through Nehemiah, I don't have time to point out all the instances, but go through the book with that in mind, and you'll find that Nehemiah was always motivating these people internally. This is what's going to glorify God. This is what puts us up, and people see that our God is powerful when you do this. It's internal motivation. He doesn't promise them riches or anything external. It's internal motivation. Nehemiah motivated them with the power of God and the glory of God. In verse 17, he motivates them to build the wall. He says that we may no longer be a reproach. This is for God's glory. It could be translated that we no longer be a disgrace as God's people. He was motivating them by the possibility of glorifying God instead of being a reproach upon the God that they have been called to glorify. In verse 18, he turns their gaze upon the power of God. That's what made the task doable. It wasn't anything they could do in themselves. You know, in the last 100 years, perhaps the most effective internal motivator in the world around us, was Winston Churchill. You know, sometimes it'd be a good study to study the speeches of Winston Churchill. Talk about getting motivated. Kathy and I watched a biography, or I watched all of it. She watched some of it, I think, on him. That was really good. Listen to just some excerpts from his speeches. I put these in your notes so you can go back and sort of Christianize them and use them maybe. He says, I have nothing, this was World War II, when it looked that England it was hopeless. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight in the seas of the ocean. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We will fight on the beaches. We will fight on the landing grounds. We will fight in the fields and in the streets, and we will fight in the hills, and we shall never surrender. Whoa, sign me up. And that's what happened in England, as well as beyond. Churchill and Nehemiah use the same type of motivation. It's internal motivation. Now, here's another reason that the prime type of motivation that a Christian leader should use should be internal and not external. There's an enemy out there, and I'm going to have to use discipline to skip some of this because it's really... I'm going to clear out a spot and pitch a fit here, all right? I think the most evil thing going on under the guise of Christianity is the health, wealth, and prosperity movement. It is not just false doctrine. It is evil and from the devil himself. It is totally external in its motivation under false pretenses. It feeds nothing but the flesh, and it makes God subservient to man and makes selfishness the prime motive for the Christian life. And I don't care to name names. And it doesn't bother. I had a lady get really upset with me because I named names, and I didn't lose any sleep over it. I love this one line from John MacArthur. This is really good. This is one line, and it'll take a minute for it to sink in. Referring to a famous best-selling book by a health, wealth, and prosperity preacher, MacArthur said this. He said, if your best life is now, it means you're going to hell. Now think of the logic of that. That's like, if your best life is now, it means you're going to hell. And that's all he did. He didn't bash anybody. He just well, let me move on to the last one. Leaders lead through God-empowered determination. Look in verse 19 and 20. Then when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard it, they laughed at us, despised us, and said, "What is this thing that you're doing? Will you rebel against the king?" So I answered them and said to them, "The God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore we, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem." Anytime you set out to lead people the way God has told you to lead, you will have opposition. We dealt with that last night. You don't ever get shocked by opposition. Somebody said, I think it was Adrian Rogers said, the door to opportunity swings on the hinges of opposition. Whoa. Anytime God's people say, "Let us arise and build," Satan and his folks say, "Let us arise and blast." Every church, every leader suffers either growing pains or dying pains, but there will be pain. That's just being real. Whenever, wherever, the realm of your leadership, wherever it may be, you will be opposed. If there is not a dogged determination that grabs hold of God and just won't let go, to persevere in God's strength, then you'll just give up. Well, I promise you that opposition will come. Sometimes it's in your own family. Sometimes it's with the people you're ministering to. Sometimes it's regulations or school boards that do away with release time. There's always going to be opposition. But those who are obeying and following the Lord, you just keep on. You get just a bulldog grip on the vision that God's given you, and you may have to adjust the timing. You may have to adjust the approach you're going to take, but don't ever give up on what God has given you to do. Amen. Father, I thank you so much for this precious, precious book. Father, all of your word is directly your word, but thank you for how Nehemiah deals with such practical things. I pray now that you would bless the rest of our time together, and I pray that we would honor you. Thank you for the opportunity to worship you through singing. What a blessing it's been this week. Thank you for giving us that means of worship. Thank you. In Jesus' name.